This is Greg Canty here, and welcome to the Win Happy podcast. Stay tuned for interesting chats with interesting people about winning their lives and being happy at the same time. This show has been brought to you by Fusion Communications. Thanks for listening. On today's podcast, I welcome back Professor Connell Fannin, Director of the Keynes Centre at UCC and co-author of The Leadership Mind. Books are a key part of the development programmes at the Keynes Centre, and critically he says, it's not the book, it's how it's read that is the most important thing. Connell describes how we should read with intent, developing a dialogue with ourselves and engaging with the author's mind, and he discusses some source thinkers, minds that can help us to refresh our own thinking. Most importantly, Connell explains the importance of our development through adulthood and how reading experiences can play a critical role in this. Let's hear from Connell. So Connell, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
Yeah, good. A big welcome back to the Win Happy podcast.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we're here in the nice setting of the Keynes Centre on the South Mall, across from my old office pretty much.
Yes.
I started in the South Mall at the age of 17.
In?
A little accountancy office across the way.
Right.
Working by day and studying by night. And do you know what? I thought it was like Wall Street.
The South Mall?
I thought the South Mall was like Wall Street. I was so excited that first day coming onto the Mall. Mm. My mother was so proud, she took a photograph of me in my brown blazer, my tan trousers, my brown woolly jumper under it, and my big head of afro brown curly hair.
These were days of colour coordination.
Oh my God almighty. And I swear to God, coming onto that street felt like Wall Street to me. I was so excited, and we see what it is. It's just a tiny little street in Cork City, the epicentre of business.
Yeah, of course, Cork was the centre of the world then, wasn't it?
Yeah. And it still is, though. It still is, I think.
Do you think so?
Oh, of course it is. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm here with Connell Fannin, Director of the Keynes Centre. And what I wanted to do was have a chat with you about books. Because I know books play a star role in what you do in the Keynes Centre. And of course, you're the co-author of a book that came out towards the end of last year, The Leadership Mind. How's that going for you? And how was the experience?
Going quite well. The response back from readers is as we could have hoped, I think. They're finding it a challenging read, but a very worthwhile read. And they're prepared to work at it, which is what we said in the introduction you have to do. It's not a skim read. But people are coming back with very good, positive responses in terms of what I like about their responses is the detail people are coming back with, the specific things that connect with them. So it's not just a general remark of I liked it or whatever. They're actually picking up things that are connecting with them and coming back and saying, yeah, this has made a difference to me.
And for the reader in advance, it's not like a Maeve Binchy cuddly novel that you can read and enjoy.
No, I'm afraid not. It might be a bestseller if it was. But, no, it's a very different book from the usual ones on leadership that you would pick up casually at an airport or in a bookshop. It is actually trying to solve some serious problems about the problem of leadership. And we think we have solved them. But it's an invitation to the reader to join us in thinking through the problems. And it's interesting that the feedback has been that the book works that way. It works as an invite to the reader to come think with us and think it through for yourself, which is all we could have asked for, really.
Yeah, and what you say in the Keynes Centre, it's not what you think, but it's how you think. That's important.
How you think is the crisis of our time. All these big crises we're having today, from the environment to the pandemic, all arise ultimately from how we think about things. People tend to focus on the what they think, and they argue about it, and everybody jumps up and down saying they're entitled to their opinions. They don't stop and think about, well, how have I reached my opinion? How am I thinking? Because that matters. You're not really entitled to your opinion, despite what people claim. If you think by your opinion and expressing it, you want to influence people, then you have a responsibility to consider how you come to it. So how we think is really the crisis of our time, and that's what we're focused on.
And for the listener, if they tune into the Leadership Mind podcast, we recorded you and your co-author and your nephew, Connell Fannin, at the launch where you discussed the book. And of course, there was a follow-up then with the benefit of, I think, a month or so, whereby people had read the book and had some time to digest it. And that was a nice discussion with Dave Kerwin of Borgash and Dee Forbes of RTE. Yeah, and I was at that session. It was quite enjoyable. The role of books in the Keynes Centre, how do you use them?
Well, there's a context we need to start with. And that's the context of the idea of continuing one's development throughout adulthood. Now, the word development has a particular meaning here, different than the usual connotations. It's quite distinct from education and training, which is what people generally focus on in terms of development. This is the idea that, if you like, we think in two ways. We think for purposes, we think to draw a conclusion about something. How will we get a bridge across the river? And we have an engineering problem like that, and we think in a certain way to solve these technical problems. There's a bigger issue in life, though, which is we're thinking for the meaning and truths of what we're doing. And we've evolved as a species, the human race has evolved as a species to be meaning-making, played a huge role in shaping the world in which we live in and the world that we had before us. And in that scenario, we have to look at people as not just intellect and not just thinking intelligently in that sense, but rather as meaning-making systems. And the most important thing you can know about anybody, including ourselves, is our stage of development as meaning makers. And hugely important research in the late 80s, the third half of the 20th century, discovered that as meaning makers, we can continue to develop throughout our adulthood. It doesn't end when our education formally ends or anything like that. And this is a big problem. Because education in our early years carries our development, they're not separated in our minds. Teachers don't even separate these things. They go together. And so when education ceases around 18, if the leaving cert maybe 21 or 22 at university, or maybe a little later, we tend to conclude our development is done. We're now adult, we're now mature, and we're not. Our meaning-making system may or may not be aligned with the world in which we live. And for that reason, we always have to pay attention now to this new research that came along. And it's one of the most important ideas, I think, of the 20th century. And that I don't give any concession to Einstein's ideas or anybody, because discoveries about human nature and human beings are fundamentally the most important of all. And yet today we're dominated by STEM thinking, science, technology, engineering, maths, as this is the only place that discoveries occur.
It's the only game in town.
Yeah, but like a great discovery was made by Immanuel Kant in the 1700s, when he discovered that people had a faculty of imagination. Before that, that wasn't understood or known. And yet nowadays, everyone would say the role of imagination in creativity and technology everywhere is absolutely crucial. So discoveries about the human mind are absolutely important discoveries, which we tend not to, cherish and celebrate in the same way we have awards for pieces of technology and things like that. So the world requires us to continue developing because it is continually becoming more complex. So the meaning-making capability we're at governs how we conduct ourselves in the world. And that's the context in which we introduce reading and books, if you put it that way. The research has pointed to the need to continue developing throughout adulthood and the question of how to do this. And otherwise, the question of whether it can be accelerated is very important, because it's shown that most people plateau at a certain stage of meaning-making capability, which is called by one of the discoverers of this work, Robert Keegan, the socializing mind. They're out of line with the complexity of the world. So 50% of a Western educated population is not aligned with the complexity of the world. And in that sense, when you look at it that way, it's no great wonder why people turn to vote for authoritarians and others who offer simplistic solutions to complex problems. We don't have the mental capability matching the complexity of the world. So this makes it both a very important and a very urgent problem, and people like Keegan and the Keynes Centre are working on the issue of how can we spread this development throughout the population and how can we accelerate it. Now, Keegan went one particular route, a coaching route, to implement his ideas. We decided to go a different route. We looked around and we thought, we'll take something that people do every day and we'll see if we can work through that to come up with a way, a method of going forward. So we latched on to, by accident more than anything, no great insight or genius, we latched on to reading, something people do every day, but do badly mostly. And over the years, 7, 8 years, we've worked out a program, a method, by which we can use reading experiences, because this kind of development is an experiential thing. It's not about information downloading, it's not about giving knowledge, facts, or anything like that. It's about how we organise our experiences into meanings and truths, into how we construct our realities out of our experiences. And we discovered that we've worked out that we can use reading experiences as a very, very powerful tool for this purpose. So we have focused on a series of programs that uses books, particular books for particular purposes to achieve this, but mainly to try and get across the message that there is a need to continue developing throughout adulthood. And it's possible. The good news is it's not biological or genetic. Anyone can do it. It's not tied to education or courses or anything like that. The bad news is most people don't do it, and they settle at a level of development that is inadequate for the world today.
Yeah, and maybe the way the world is constructed, going back to coming onto the South Mall, 1982, you do your 5-year accountancy course. There's the 4 levels. You come out the end of it, hopefully, in not too long, and you're qualified. So off you go now, sunshine, go into the big bad world.
You think you're finished.
Yeah, you're rocking. But it's all constructed that way, isn't it? Yes. You have your degree and off you go. And of course, then we have maybe the professional layer on top of that, like the MBAs, but this comes after all of that.
MBAs and things like that, they're very important, but they do fall into the side of the education training side. Yeah. Again, like any education or training, they may carry some of this kind of development we're talking about, this meaning and truth-making capability development, but they're not particularly designed for that or intended for that. The problem, as I said earlier, is people confuse the two. They don't see the distinction. So they don't tend to turn towards development, to continue the development. They think the education is ceased and it's done.
Okay. So 2023, I want to develop myself this year. I'm considering joining up in the Keynes Centre and signing up for one of your programs. For the person that's sitting at home and they're trying to advance themselves, a bit of learning for this year. Could you pick out a few books or recommend a few books? Or is that even how it works?
Well, it is. I mean, there's no great mystery about the whole thing. It's not so much I suppose I should point out at the beginning, and I'm following C.S. Lewis on this, it's not so much the book, it's how it's read. Okay. It's how you read a book, how you approach it, what are you reading for? Now, most of the time, and there's nothing problematic about this, it's fine. We read for pleasure, we read for entertainment, we read for distraction. Now we're getting kind of where it's not so good. We read as a last resort, we read to kill time. They're not good reasons for reading. You're better off going for a walk. So generally we read for what we call read for content. And you have a huge number of book clubs all over the country, and essentially they're reading for content. And that's grand, it's enjoyment, it's social, it's pleasure, it's everything. We have a different approach though, which is in addition to reading for content, the ideas, the content of the book, we can also read with the intention of continuing our development. And that requires us asking when we're reading what we call the developmental question. What are the implications for how I think of what I'm reading. And for that to work, you have to engage with an author, with an author's mind, in a more immediate way, in a more direct way than you normally do when you're just reading for entertainment or to pass time or whatever. So when we're reading with intent, we're reading with a view to reading for change, for reading for changing how we think. And by engaging with another mind in the different way they think, we're having experience of that mind, how they think, and we're looking at ourselves. It's not a question of judging the book. That's the important point C.S. Lewis was making. It's not that the book is good or bad. It's our reading is good or bad. How we read is good or bad. And in our case, we're helping people learn how to read for their own continuing development. What are the implications for how I think? And engaging with the mind of the author for that purpose. So you're in dialogue with another mind. Dialogue is crucial to the whole method we have. And it's dialogue first with the author of the book. It's dialogue with the group in the reading group, which we call a book circle rather than a book club, for the reason we're reading with intent. And it's ultimately dialogue with yourself. All of us are involved in a dialogue with ourselves. As Hannah Arendt beautifully pointed out, we're never alone. There's always me and myself. We're always in conversation. Now, some of these conversations get pathological, in which ways we call them depression, because the me or myself is battering the other one. But productively, this conversation, this dialogue of me and myself is a very powerful developmental movement, a very powerful developmental tool, where, if you like, simplistically a bit, the me is what we live out in the world, and myself is what I come home to, so I'm never alone. And that myself questions the me, what am I up to, what am I doing? And that kind of a dialogue is very productive. But as I say, it can get pathological, in which case it is a pathology, it is an illness, which isn't pleasant. But it's so used productively, and that's what we try to do, is show people how to use this natural internal dialogue as an extension of dialogue with others, as an extension with dialogue with the author, to become a change agent of yourself.
So, how do I read with intent?
You read with intent by simply, and it is simply, asking yourself certain questions. A dialogue is an open-ended conversation with a view to changing how I think, and it's driven by questions. And the very first question is the developmental one. What are the implications for how I think? Now, that already forces other questions about how am I going to read. John Maynard Keynes, after whom we've called our centre, has a beautiful little essay on where he talks about reading with goodwill. The first thing you have to do is approach a book, an author, with goodwill. You're interested in their thinking, in their mind. You're not interested in judging them as such. You're not interested in condemning them. And that's often what we do when we read a book. We're reading a book and we say the book is bad, the book's no good, or something like that. And yet, as C.S. Lewis says, maybe the question we should be asking is, how good a reader have I been? And it's not about the book. So we read with goodwill. We read with an openness to test and explore our own ways of thinking, how we're making sense of the world, what kind of a meaning-making system am I? Because what development level am I at in terms of my meaning-making capability? And in dialogue with authors, like Hannah Arendt, or Norman MacLean and other people we use, we can explore ourselves, provided we're reading with goodwill.
Okay.
That's the key ethic of reading.
So does that mean when you're reading, you allow yourself windows of reflection?
Mm-hmm.
And I presume there's reading moments as well, because most people, they're reading to study for something, or for news and up to date, what's happening in the world.
You're reading for information. You're reading
to help you not off to sleep at night.
No, you do have to create a space. But if you think of it this way, at any stage of our lives, we have a mental structure, and that's what's called a durable mental structure. To get away from that current durable mental structure, we have to create a space apart, as Robert Keegan calls it. A place apart where we can explore as best we can that structure. Now, that's not something that can be done alone, because what you're doing is you're trying to use part of your mental structure to look at another part of it, and you need help in that, because the part can't embrace the whole. It has to have help to do that. So you need what we call a trusted critical friend, and the Keynes Centre tries to be that to people. A trusted critical friend in the sense that they can be trusted to have no other agenda than your goodwill and your development. Critical because it has to challenge your current thinking, way of thinking and how you're thinking. Not so much what you think as how you've come to think that. And in that sense, critical means not negative or pejorative. It means an argument. You've set out basically an argument to your friend, to the other person, about how they're thinking. And if that argument is valid, then that person must pay attention to it. And that's the simple, as Justin Keating said in his book, Nothing Cast in Stone, show me better and I must change. And that really is the ethic of all of this. And the third part is the friend, the trusted critical friend. The person must be caring and there long term. They must be with you through the journey. Now that straight away contrasts with much of what goes on, we'll say, in the consultancy field, where it's in and out, it's a day's work or 2 days or 3 days and in and out, and it can't build that relationship of trusted critical friend. So working with people, and in the Keynes Centre, the trusted critical friends hopefully are us, and the group that we create that emerges in the process, and it can be other people. But it's very important to find a trusted critical friend for continuing this development.
Okay. So it sounds to me like that circle brings in those other voices and those other perspectives.
That's why it's called a circle rather than a club.
Yeah, and ultimately when you're reading with intent, you're trying to create that for yourself, which is going to be difficult because you need to be fairly rock solid to be able to do that for yourself, I'm guessing.
Yes, but it can strengthen you too. It can build confidence. We've found that over the years, people have come back and, you know, the things we might have thought we were doing for them mightn't be the things they have taken away long term. And many have come back, a good few have come back and said it's built their confidence through actually improving their reading. That their reading, I mean, if I use the word level, it sounds like school, but their reading has changed enormously and they're now reading differently. And that's back to the original point I made. It's not the book, it's how it's read.
In the second podcast, we did the feedback about the book with Dave Curban. I thought it was interesting to hear him talking with Peter Drucker. Mm-hmm. And it sounds to me like he was his sounding board, but he seemed to have a method of reading that helped him to extract enormous value from that reading.
Yes.
And I was thinking, listening to him, that maybe someone else reading the same book wouldn't get half as much from it.
What Dave, I think, showed there brilliantly in that session, and it's on our podcast, is the benefit of connecting with a mind and staying with a mind long term. When people read books, too often you'll hear people say, oh, I've read that, or I've read something. In fact, I remember when I was growing up in Tralee, a neighbour coming to my mother about her husband being bored and asking had she any ideas what he might do. And she said, well, will you read a book? And the neighbour replied, oh, he's read one once. Now, that's pretty extreme. But a lot of people just read a book once. And that's this kind of standard approach to reading. I've read it, it's done, gone. That's not really good reading. A good reader, as Nabokov said, is a rereader. And he explained why, because he said the first time the biology takes over, the eyes are shifting along the lines and dominating, the mind isn't really absorbing and whatever. So you have to come back and you have to come back. So a good reader is a rereader. And one of the things I discovered a long time ago, learning to become a professional economist, was this benefit of connecting with getting to know a mind. And I found an economist called James Clark, whose work I never used professionally, but whose work I read throughout my life because the mind engaged me. It gave me something all the time, it refreshed me. It's what we call in the Keynes Centre our source thinkers, the minds that refresh our thinking.
Okay.
Even though I never actually was utilitarian about him and used them.
But he was poking at you and agitating you.
Yeah, and he was showing me what a good mind is like.
Yeah.
Now, he wasn't, most people won't have heard of James Clark in the way they'll have heard of James Keynes. But So he's a minor figure really in the world of economics. But it was such a lovely mind to get to know. Now another one like that is William James. In the bleak winter days, I tend to turn to reading William James, and I couldn't recommend anyone nicer than his mind to engage in the dark winter nights with in a conversation. So Dave is one of the people who have discovered Drucker as a company to keep throughout your life, and he has benefited enormously from really what would have been, what is, and still ongoing for him, as we saw, a powerful, stimulating dialogue with Peter Drucker, who's of course Dave, but through his works. And it's the way that Dave reads it, it's the purpose he's reading for. He's reading with intent. He's reading to explore how he's thinking, not judge Drucker, not say he's finished with him, not read it and say that's it, it's information or whatever. He's reading to explore how he's thinking at any time. And you can keep coming back to that, because he will always stimulate you to move on in your thinking.
Okay. So really it's about method and intent.
Attitude.
And attitude towards the actual book that you're reading, and accepting that you need to challenge what you're reading and think for yourself and reflect.
Yes.
So at a very practical level, I imagine a pad and a pen might be useful things. Are you allowed to scribble in the book, are you?
Well, you have to.
You have to scribble in the book.
Yeah. We've had people over the years who've come in and been horrified when they see what I do to my books. They've come through school where you must keep your books pristine and clean, or you have to anyway. And they look in horror when I say, no, you can't do a dialogue with it. And that's why a book, I know people promote the Kindle and other technology stuff, and say, yes, they've got great for putting down notes and tracking things, and they have their benefit, they have their value, but nothing like a physical book in which you scribble your immediate thoughts, and then you can come back and scribble your next thoughts, and you see what's happening to you. You can actually track your changing mind.
Yeah, you're forming your own thoughts when you're right.
Yes.
Yes. Quite simply. So it's how you think.
It's how you think.
And not what you think.
Yeah. And that's, William James, just going back to him for a moment, has a wonderful phrase. He's got the best definition I know of the word, of the idea of vision. Like, vision's a word that's used a lot in business, and it's been trivialized and emptied of content. William James defines vision as one's preferred best working attitude. It's how the world works. It's the whole drift of life, as he says. It's how you see the world. And that idea of your preferred best working attitude is what we use to kind of help people define how they want to read, how they want to go forward with the time they spend reading and reflecting.
So it's not what you read, it's how you read. And having said that, you are going to give me a few books that helped you to wrestle with ideas and ones that poked you along the way.
Right.
You might just give me a few. Might just give me a few.
Well, at the risk of being a bit egotistic about this, I suppose I'd have to start with being an economist, so it would have to be Keynes. And not Keynes, the economist that people read about in the newspapers, but Keynes, the thinker about thinking. And one of his great ideas that we use here is that it's not new ideas that are difficult, it's escaping from old ones. And when you reflect on that for a while, it doesn't work instantly, but when you reflect on that for a while, you realise what you have to do. Another great person that has been important to us is Hannah Arendt. We have a series of source thinkers, as we call them, I mentioned earlier.
Give me that name again.
Hannah Arendt.
Okay.
And she's famous and well known for her Eichmann in Jerusalem book, her report on the Eichmann trial. She's one of the great thinkers of the 20th century. She was ignored for a long time. Now she's basically everywhere. Her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, is a great starting point, because what you're reading about here is a person who, by any way of reasonableness, we would say was a monster. And yet she challenges us immediately about that. She makes it very clear, Eichmann was not a monster. Now what have you got? You can ignore her and dismiss her, or you can stop and say, okay, how did I think of Eichmann as a monster? Why was I using the concept of monster to look at him? And of course she makes the point that that's very easy for us. If Einstein was a monster, Well, most of us aren't monsters, so we don't need to worry. But if Einstein was only thoughtless, if Einstein lacked the ability to think, to put himself into the position of other people, then we're all capable of that. So suddenly now we have to think about ourselves and how we think. And that's the great challenge that Hannah Arendt puts to us at the outset of reading her in the Eichmann and Jerusalem book. We become aware that we're imposing concepts on the world, and we need to do a bit of hygiene work on those concepts. They might be leaving us off responsibility for our own behaviour. So thoughtlessness is a common feature. It's a source of bullying and things like that. And she makes us reflect on ourselves. Yeah. What are the implications for me of how I think reading Eichmann in Jerusalem? Not reading about Eichmann as such. And that's not to dismiss now how horrible everything was and all that. That was terrible. But when we're reading for change, we're reading for ourselves. What are we doing to ourselves? How are we thinking? Okay, nowadays there's an idea that everything is a narrative. Business has taken it on, everybody's taken it on, we're all telling stories. So it's very useful to look at.
Now be very careful now, because this is what we tell all our clients.
I know, I'm well aware business is everything. But this will be a book of interest to you for that reason. Peter Brooks, who was one of the writers who began this idea back in the 70s, 80s about life as a narrative and all this kind of thing, and we tell ourselves stories and all, has written a lovely book called Seduced by Story, The Use and Abuse of Narrative. Now, he doesn't say get rid of narrative, far from it, but it's a great book to actually read and see how to use it, how it's abused, and see how to use it right. So that's a current book, fairly recent, which I'd recommend. Another book, because what you're doing when you're starting to read with intent, what the first thing you're doing is you're becoming aware of yourself as a collection of ideas, as a collection of concepts and theories that you're looking at the world through that lens of those things. And what you need to do is become aware of them and realize that the ideas you're working with is not you yourself. These are things you've accumulated. They may have you, as we say, but you should have them. And this is the first step of development, of separating yourself from ideas and using them as ideas, not as things that have you. So we live in a world, we swim in a world of politics. We actually swim in a sea of politics, to correct the metaphor. And it behoves us to think about how we think about politics. Now, very often again today, there's such a cynicism that people turn off politics. The condemnation of politicians and everything else is pervasive. And, some of it's understandable. The cynicism is not nice and so on. But we do live in a world of politics, and we have to deal with it. So what ideas are we using? Well, David Runciman published last year a lovely book called Confronting Leviathan, A History of Ideas. This is a series of short essays, each one centred on a major thinker, starting with Hobbes way back, coming right through Mary Wollstonecraft on feminism, right up to date to Fukuyama, on the relationship between citizens and rulers. So if you think politics is just about what you see the talking heads on the television every night talking nonsense, it's not. We have a sense of a relationship between ourselves as citizens and our rulers. And it does behove us to think about that relationship. How has it evolved? How is it evolving? And you see, for example, in the relationship with Putin's regime in Russia, how the relationship between citizens and rulers has emerged from the perestroika days of Gorbachev. You see what happened with Trump, how close that came to, if not a tyranny, at least an authoritarian regime. Brazil with Bolsonaro, Hungary with Orban, and so on. Italy has just turned in that direction now. So we do have to think about what is our relationship between us and our rulers, and what do we want. And when we give our rulers basically total control, then we're lost. So it is important that we think, and Runciman's book essays are brilliant stimulation for that purpose.
Yeah.
Another person I like, again I mentioned earlier that staying with an author, and there are a number of authors that I would recommend to people to try and get to know. There's a lovely short biography in a Critical Life series of Hannah Arendt by Reaction Books in London in 2021. And it's written by Samantha Hill, who is a deep reader of Hannah Arendt. And Hannah Arendt's thinking has actually shaped her life greatly. And one of Hannah Arendt's great insights is that all thinking comes from personal experience. And that's a grounding principle in our approach. And that's why we can say reading experiences are developmental experiences. You don't have to go bungee jumping or you don't have to go paragliding to have these kind of outward bound experiences. You can actually read and relate to an author's mind, and that's an experience for development. And it's a direct experience. Reading is not a passive experience. It needn't be. It can be. Many people read passively. But if you read actively, it's a developmental experience. And going back, repeating Hannah Arendt's point, our thinking comes from our experiences. And that's one of the great strengths of her that this book brings out beautifully. Another chap, we're talking about change, another chap that's very interesting is Adam Phillips, a serious Freudian psychotherapist at a time when Freud is dismissed a lot, but a very serious one, and gives you a very different view of Freudianism than is often conveyed in the public media. Adam Phillips wrote two lovely books in 2021 and 2022, a pair of them, short ones, called On Wanting to Change and then On Getting Better. And in it, he makes the point we should always be paying attention to how we think about change and how what we think about change changes over time. Indeed, one of the more puzzling things we have to acknowledge is that how we think about change is changing all the time. So this is the challenge in a way, to always figure out, if every practice is based on theory, as Peter Druck says, what's my theory of change? You're working with some theory of change, whether you know it or not. And Adam Phillips gets you to think about that very deeply, very nicely. And they're lovely little books, quite short.
So, Connell, on the subject of change, it's as much about the books, but it's also about how I read the books.
Your best working attitude. Your best reading attitude.
So, put some time aside, have pen and paper ready, don't be afraid to scribble,
yes,
and read with intent.
And above all, don't fall into the trap of thinking, which a lot of people unfortunately do, and it's sad, of saying, someday I'll give myself time. I'm so busy now. And this is rough in a way, because at the time of our lives when we really should be devoting time to attending to ourselves and how we think, we tend to be getting busy, getting married, having children, buying houses, building houses, whatever. And those crucial 2 decades are suddenly gone, and yet they're crucial. But okay, development can continue throughout adulthood, so it's never too late. But there is this tendency to always think, if I put a metaphor on it, the idea of being in a safe harbour. Someday I'll get to where it's quiet and safe and I can settle down and do it. No, the point about all this is, first of all, you don't get that safe harbour. Life is always churning along for us. But second of all, it's about how we organise our experiences. And the important thing, and that's why we pick reading, the important thing is to use daily experiences to reflect on how we're organising our experiences into our meanings and truths, how we're using them to construct our realities in which we live, so that you never defer. You get into the habit, best working practice, as James says, as soon as you can, of reflecting on daily experiences, things happening throughout the day, and working with them in terms of, this is my experience, how am I thinking about it, how am I shaping it into my reality? No, you can't do this all the time, you'll be exhausted, you'll go mental. The important thing though is to do it enough, and is to do it, not defer until some idyllic time in the future where you're in a safe harbour, calm sea, and you're leisurely sitting there. It doesn't happen. And anyway, it's too late when you get there.
So start now.
Start now, exactly.
Connell Fannin, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Good man yourself. Thank you for listening to the Win Happy podcast, which has been brought to you by Fusion Communications. If you'd like to get in touch, feel free to send me an email at greg@fusion.ie. So until next time, take it easy.